The Story of Silver and Gold, Chapter 1, The Talking Problem. Tom had always been a talker. Whether he was with his friends, family, or colleagues, he couldn't stop talking. His words seemed to flow endlessly, even when no one was asking him to speak. His friends used to joke that Tom could talk for hours without taking a breath, and he would just laugh along with them, never realizing that sometimes his constant talking caused problems. Tom was in his late 20s and worked as a graphic designer at a small company. He was creative, clever, and always came up with ideas for new projects. But his ability to talk about anything and everything had become a double-edged sword. In meetings, he often spoke over others, interrupted people, and even told long, unnecessary stories. While he thought his jokes and stories were funny, others started to feel frustrated. One afternoon, Tom's team was in the middle of a brainstorming session for a new advertising campaign. The room was filled with people, each eager to share their ideas. As usual, Tom was the first to speak. "I've got a great idea. What if we make the ad really dramatic, like the product can save the day in a way that no one expects? It's like a superhero product. But we have to make it emotional too. Imagine this. The product is the hero. The unsung hero that no one knows they need. You know what I mean?" Tom's voice echoed through the room and he kept going, describing his idea in even more detail. His team members exchanged glances and a few of them sighed quietly. They wanted to share their thoughts, but Tom's voice drowned them out. Finally, Sarah, one of the senior designers, spoke up. "Tom, that's an interesting idea, but we've heard it already. Can we hear someone else's thoughts too?" Her voice was calm but firm. Tom paused, confused. He didn't realize how much he had spoken. "Oh, I didn't mean to take over the whole discussion. Sorry about that," he said, looking around the room. But the damage was done. A few of his colleagues looked annoyed, and others seemed frustrated that they hadn't had a chance to speak. Tom felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He had always thought that speaking up made him a part of the conversation, but now he saw that it had the opposite effect. His words, instead of helping, had pushed people away. Later that day, Tom went to the office kitchen to make a coffee. He leaned against the counter, lost in thought. "Why do I always talk so much?" he asked himself. "I don't mean to, but it's like my mouth just won't stop." He shook his head. Maybe he needed to change. Maybe it was time to start listening more and talking less. As Tom stirred his coffee, he thought about his relationships. His friends often complained that he talked too much. His family would sometimes say, "Tom, we love hearing your stories, but can you let someone else talk?" Even in his personal life, his constant talking had created distance between him and the people he cared about. They loved him, but they often felt like they couldn't get a word in. That night, Tom sat on his couch at home, scrolling through his phone. He came across a quote. "Sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing at all." It struck him. He had never really considered silence as a way to communicate. He had always thought that words were the best way to express himself, to connect with others. But now, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Tom decided that he would try something new. He would challenge himself to speak less, to let others share their thoughts before he spoke. He wasn't sure how it would go, but he was ready to try. Maybe if he listened more, he would understand others better. And maybe, just maybe, he would start to understand himself better too. As he walked to work, Tom thought about how difficult this might be. "I've been talking too much for so long," he thought. "But I can change. It's time to stop filling every silence with words. I need to learn when to listen and when to speak." At the office, Tom greeted his colleagues. He smiled and said hello, but he didn't immediately jump into a conversation. He kept quiet, waiting for someone else to speak. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but he stayed silent. By the end of the day, Tom realized something surprising. He didn't miss talking as much as he thought he would. In fact, he found that being quiet gave him more space to think, to observe, and to truly listen. He began to notice things he hadn't before. How his coworkers interacted with each other, the little gestures and expressions that spoke louder than words. That evening, he went home feeling different. He wasn't sure if he had completely changed, but he knew he was on the right path. And so Tom's journey had begun. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to find the power of silence, to speak less, and to speak at the right time. The Story of Silver and Gold, Chapter 2, The Consequences of Too Many Words. The next few days after Tom's decision to speak less were not as easy as he had hoped. Every time he walked into the office or met up with his friends, he was confronted by the habit he had spent years building. It was difficult to stay quiet when the urge to speak was so strong. Tom often found himself holding his tongue, only to later feel uncomfortable with the silence. He wasn't used to letting others fill the space. At work, things weren't improving much. His colleagues, though polite, still seemed distant. They didn't seem to engage with him the same way they used to. Tom noticed this particularly during meetings, when his attempts to remain silent were met with an awkward tension in the room. It was as if his new behavior had created an invisible wall between him and his coworkers. They didn't know how to respond to him when he wasn't the one dominating the conversation. One afternoon, Tom sat in a meeting with his team, listening carefully to everyone's ideas. The group was discussing a new design for a marketing campaign. He had made a decision not to speak until everyone else had shared their thoughts. Sarah, the senior designer, was leading the discussion. "Okay, we have a few directions for this campaign," she said, pointing to a list of ideas on the whiteboard. "But I want to hear everyone's opinion before we make any decisions. Tom, why don't you go first this time?" Tom froze for a moment. He wasn't used to being asked to speak at a specific time. Usually he jumped in without hesitation, but now he had been waiting for everyone else to speak first, and he felt strangely out of place. Sure," he said, trying to gather his thoughts. His words faltered as he realized he had no idea what to say. Normally he would have had a long explanation ready, but this time, the silence he had allowed in the room made him second-guess everything he said. Sarah raised an eyebrow and gave him a slight nod. "Take your time," she said kindly. Tom's mind raced. He wanted to sound smart and insightful, but the more he tried to think, the more his thoughts felt scattered. The silence felt too heavy. He could see his colleagues looking at him, waiting for something. But instead of feeling the usual excitement to share his opinion, he felt a wave of doubt. "I don't know," Tom muttered, his voice almost inaudible. "I think we should consider maybe simplifying the design, but I'm not sure. I just need to think about it more." The room fell silent. Sarah nodded, her expression a little confused, but she quickly moved on. "Okay, that's a start. Let's hear what the rest of you think." As Tom sat back in his chair, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. It wasn't just the awkward silence that bothered him. It was the way he had failed to contribute. His usual flood of words had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but uncertainty. Later that day, he met his best friend, Mike, for a coffee. Mike had been Tom's friend for years, and the two had shared countless hours talking about everything under the sun. But lately, Mike had started noticing that Tom was quieter than usual. "What's going on, man?" Mike asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "You've been awfully quiet lately. It's weird. You've always had something to say, but now it's like you're holding back." Tom hesitated before answering. He hadn't told Mike about his decision to speak less, but he wasn't sure how to explain it. "I've been trying something new," he said slowly. "I'm trying to talk less, listen more. It's harder than I thought." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Talk less? You? Man, you've been talking since we were kids. What happened to the guy who could talk non-stop about anything?" Tom smiled weakly. "Yeah, that's the problem. I think I've been talking too much and it's starting to cause some problems. People are getting annoyed. I don't think they want to hear me all the time. So I decided to try something different. I thought if I listened more, maybe they'd feel more comfortable talking." Mike leaned back in his chair, considering Tom's words. "I get it," he said. "But you can't just shut yourself down completely. You're one of the most interesting people I know. You have a lot of good things to say. But maybe you just need to find the right balance." Tom felt a small spark of hope. Maybe Mike was right. Maybe he didn't have to completely stop talking, he just needed to speak at the right moments. The next day, back at work, Tom decided to try something different. He would still hold back, but he would also wait for the right moment to speak. He realized that maybe the problem wasn't talking too much. It was talking too often, without considering whether it was the right time or place. In the afternoon meeting, Tom sat quietly as Sarah presented a new idea. His mind raced with thoughts. He had an opinion. He wanted to share it, but he also knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about the team and their ideas. He looked around the room. His colleagues were speaking thoughtfully, each contributing their own perspective. When Sarah paused and looked toward him, Tom took a deep breath. This was his moment. Instead of rushing to speak, he carefully considered his words. He raised his hand slightly and waited for Sarah to acknowledge him. "Tom?" Sarah asked. "I think we're on the right track," Tom said slowly, his voice steady. "But maybe we could push this idea further. What if we took it to the next level? Maybe something more dynamic, like," he paused, thinking carefully, "more contrast in the visuals, to really catch attention. I'm just thinking out loud, but that's the direction I'd like to explore." There was a moment of silence, and then Sarah nodded. "That's an interesting suggestion, Tom. Let's explore that further. Thanks for sharing." Tom sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief. His idea wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. And it was exactly what he had been trying to do. Speak at the right moment, with the right words. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt like he had found a small victory in his quest for balance. After the meeting, Sarah pulled him aside. "Tom, I think I saw a change in you today. You were more measured in your approach, and I think your idea really added value. Keep it up." Tom smiled, grateful for the feedback. It wasn't easy to change, but it was clear that taking his time to speak was starting to make a difference. He didn't need to dominate every conversation. He just needed to be present, to listen, and to contribute thoughtfully when the time was right. That evening, as Tom walked home, he reflected on the day. He wasn't perfect and he still had a long way to go, but he was starting to understand something important. The real power wasn't in filling every silence with words. The real power was in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to be quiet. And for the first time, Tom was starting to feel the weight of that power. The Story of Silver and Gold, Chapter 3, The Ripple Effect. Tom had been working hard on speaking less. Although it wasn't easy, he was getting better at listening without interrupting. The initial awkwardness of silence was fading, but his internal struggle remained. Every day he had to remind himself to stay quiet, resisting the urge to jump into conversations too quickly. His colleagues, especially Sarah, had noticed the change. She was more open to hearing Tom's thoughts, but still cautious, sensing that he was holding back. His silence was different, unsettling, yet somehow positive. Later that day, Tom's coworker Alex walked up to him and said, "Tom, I noticed a difference today. You were quiet, but when you spoke it was clear you were really thinking. I'm impressed." Tom smiled, proud of his progress. He was learning to speak with intention. That evening at home, Tom found his younger sister Lucy sitting on the couch, absorbed in her phone. He sat down beside her quietly. After a few minutes, Lucy looked up and noticed the calmness in his presence. "You're quieter than usual. What's up with you?" she asked. Tom replied gently, "I've been focusing on listening more." Lucy paused for a moment, then smiled. "I like it. I've been stressed lately, and sometimes I just want someone to listen. It's nice when someone actually hears you out." Tom felt warmth spread through him. He hadn't realized how much his constant talking had affected his relationships. Just being there with Lucy, listening, was enough. Later at dinner, his mother Karen commented, "Maybe we should all work on listening more. Your father and I talk a lot, but sometimes it's hard for anyone else to get a word in." That evening, as they sat together, Tom's father, Richard, reflected out loud, "I've been thinking about what you said, Tom. Listening more really does make a difference." Tom smiled, feeling good about the change his efforts had sparked in his family. "It's not about not talking," Tom said. "It's about knowing when to talk and when to just listen." Richard nodded in agreement. "Well said, Tom. I think we've all learned something." Tom felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his journey toward speaking less was creating a positive change, not just in himself, but in his relationships. The invitation had come as a surprise. Tom's colleague, Sarah, had been planning a casual get-together at her home for weeks and had invited the entire team. Social gatherings weren't something Tom usually looked forward to. They made him anxious. In the past, he had dominated conversations to mask his discomfort, only to leave feeling drained and disconnected. But this time, Tom felt different. His journey toward listening more and speaking less had begun to change how he approached these situations. Instead of dreading the evening, he saw it as an opportunity to put his newfound skills to the test. When Tom arrived at Sarah's house, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Soft music played in the background, and groups of people stood chatting, holding drinks and plates of appetizers. Sarah greeted him at the door with a smile. "Tom, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, handing him a glass of sparkling water. "Thanks for inviting me," Tom replied, keeping his tone light. He smiled, feeling a flutter of nerves, but also a sense of calm. He reminded himself to observe, listen, and speak only when he had something meaningful to say. As Tom moved into the living room, he spotted a small group from work gathered around the coffee table, discussing the latest trends in their industry. The conversation was lively. Normally, Tom would have jumped in right away, eager to share his thoughts, but this time he chose to hang back, listening closely. At first, Tom's silence went unnoticed, but as the discussion continued, some of his colleagues began to glance his way, curious about his thoughts. Eventually, one of them, Mark, turned to him. "What do you think, Tom?" Mark asked, gesturing toward him. "You always have interesting insights." Tom took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. After he shared his idea, Mark smiled. "That's a good point. I hadn't considered that. Thanks, Tom." Tom felt a surge of confidence. By choosing his words carefully and speaking with intention, he had added value to the conversation without dominating it. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. As the evening went on, Tom continued to observe and engage when it felt right. He found himself drawn to a quieter corner of the room where a few unfamiliar faces were chatting. One of them, a tall man with glasses, seemed particularly engaged in a discussion about books. Tom, an avid reader, couldn't resist joining in. "Excuse me," Tom said politely. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you talking about the latest John Grisham novel?" The man turned to him with a smile. "Yes, we are. You've read it?" "I have," Tom replied, his excitement evident but controlled. "I thought the pacing was fantastic, but I wasn't sure about the ending. It felt a bit rushed to me." The man nodded in agreement. "Exactly. That's what I was saying. I felt like the story had so much potential, but the ending didn't quite deliver." Their conversation flowed naturally from there. The man introduced himself as James, a freelance writer, and the two quickly bonded over their shared love of thrillers. Others in the group chimed in, and soon Tom found himself in the center of an engaging discussion. Not because he was talking the most, but because he was truly listening and responding in a way that made others feel heard. One moment stood out in particular. A young woman named Emma, who had been quiet for most of the evening, approached Tom as he stood by the kitchen counter. "Hi, Tom," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, I really admire how you've been engaging with everyone tonight. You're not like most people, you actually listen." Tom was taken aback by her honesty. "Thank you, Emma. That means a lot." He realized how different this moment felt. He wasn't leading the conversation, yet he felt more connected than ever. Their conversation continued, and Tom learned that Emma was new to the company and had been feeling nervous about fitting in. By simply listening to her, Tom was able to put her at ease and help her feel more connected. By the end of the night, Tom had made several new connections. James invited him to join a local book club, and Emma suggested meeting up for coffee to discuss an upcoming project. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt like he was truly connecting with people, not by trying to impress them, but by being himself. In the weeks that followed, Tom's new friendships grew. He attended James's book club, where he found himself surrounded by people who valued thoughtful discussion. He met Emma for coffee and discovered they had a lot in common, both professionally and personally. These connections felt different from the relationships he had formed in the past. They were built on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine communication. Tom's experience at Sarah's gathering marked a turning point in his journey. By learning to listen more and speak less, he had not only improved his own communication skills, but had also inspired others to open up and connect on a deeper level. The friendships he formed that night became a testament to the power of thoughtful, intentional communication. As Tom walked home that evening, he realized that true connection wasn't about saying the right things. It was about truly hearing others reflected on the night. It hadn't been perfect. There were moments when he had felt the urge to talk more, but he had stayed mindful, and that made all the difference. Because true connection isn't about saying the right things, it's about truly hearing others. The story of silver and gold. Final chapter, the test of control. It was a crisp Monday morning, and Tom felt unusually positive as he walked into the office. His weekend had been peaceful, filled with quiet reflection and time spent with his new friends. But that morning, Tom was about to face a situation that would test everything he had learned. As Tom settled into his desk, he noticed an email flagged as urgent in his inbox. It was from Sarah, and its subject line made his stomach drop. Project files missing. Urgent issue. Tom clicked the email, his heart pounding. Sarah explained that the files for a major client presentation had somehow been deleted from the shared drive. The presentation was scheduled for that afternoon, and without those files, the entire project and their team's reputation was at risk. Tom quickly checked the shared drive. The files were gone, just as Sarah had said. Panic began to rise in his chest as he remembered something. He had been the last person to access the files on Friday. It was possible that, in his rush to finish work before the weekend, he had accidentally deleted them. Before Tom could think of a solution, Sarah appeared at his desk, looking flustered. "Tom, do you know what happened to the project files? I saw your name as the last editor before they disappeared." Tom felt a wave of guilt and dread wash over him. In the past, his immediate reaction would have been defensive, perhaps making excuses or trying to shift blame. But now he took a deep breath, pausing to think before he spoke. "I'm really sorry, Sarah," he said calmly. "I think this might have been my mistake. I'll do everything I can to fix it." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though she still looked worried. "Okay," she said, "but we need to figure this out quickly. The presentation is in a few hours." Tom nodded. "I understand. Let's see if we can recover the files or recreate them together." As Tom worked with Sarah to address the issue, he couldn't ignore the anger bubbling inside him. Not at Sarah, but at himself. How could he have been so careless? The stakes were high, and the pressure to fix the mistake was mounting. At one point, while frantically searching through backups, Mark approached them. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing at the stressed expressions on their faces. Sarah quickly explained the situation, and Mark frowned. "Tom, this is a pretty big screw-up. How could you let this happen?" Tom felt his anger rise again, this time directed at Mark. It wasn't the first time Mark had criticized him, and in the past Tom might have snapped back with a sharp retort. But instead he paused. He took another deep breath, letting the anger settle before responding. "You're right, Mark," he said evenly. "I made a mistake and I take full responsibility, but pointing fingers won't help us fix it. If you have time, we could use your help to recreate the files." Mark seemed taken aback by Tom's composed response. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right. Let me see what I can do to help." With everyone working together, the team managed to recover most of the files from old email attachments and draft versions. Tom stayed calm throughout the process, offering clear guidance and supporting his colleagues without panicking. By the time the presentation began, they had salvaged enough to impress the client, and the crisis was averted. After the meeting, Sarah pulled Tom aside. "I have to say, I'm impressed," she admitted. "I know how stressful this was, but you stayed calm and focused. I don't think we would have pulled it off without you." Tom smiled faintly, still feeling the weight of his earlier mistake, but grateful for Sarah's words. "Thanks, Sarah. I've been working on staying calm and thinking before I speak. It's not always easy, but I think it's made a difference." "It definitely has," Sarah said. "You handled this with so much grace. I can't imagine what would have happened if you'd let the pressure get to you." The incident left Tom reflecting on how much he had changed. In the past, his anger and defensiveness might have escalated the situation, causing tension with his colleagues and making it harder to solve the problem. But by staying calm, he had turned a potential disaster into an opportunity to strengthen his relationships. The experience with the missing files had taught Tom an important lesson. control over his words also meant control over his emotions. By pausing before reacting, he could approach even the most difficult situations with wisdom and compassion. As time went on, Tom found himself happier and more at peace. One evening as he walked home from work, Tom reflected on how far he had come. He no longer felt the need to fill every silence or prove himself through his words. Instead, he had discovered the power of listening, the strength in calmness, and the beauty of speaking only when it truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Tom felt truly content.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the story. Please consider liking and sharing it with your friends. Your feedback and support are invaluable in helping us improve and continue bringing you great content. We truly appreciate your help.